In this video, we're going to practice evaluating math expressions using the order of operations. The order of operations are used in order to evaluate expressions that contain combinations of numbers, operations, and variables. So we have the order of operations in order to help us be consistent in how we evaluate math. So what happens in the math world, if there are a lot of operations and numbers contained in a problem, it can get confusing to figure out what operation you're supposed to perform first. So the order of operations exists to give us some guidelines on how to evaluate math, so we all evaluate math in the same consistent fashion. And the order of operations utilize this PEMDAS acronym to help us walk through the order of operations, and that's what we're going to break down today. So first, let's take a look at the P. The P in PEMDAS comes first, and what this is telling us is we always evaluate anything that is contained inside of parentheses first. Now, parentheses can be any sort of grouping device in math. So this can mean that it could be the absolute value symbols, this could be something underneath a square root, etc. Anything that groups items together, we need to perform what's inside of that grouping or inside of those parentheses first. So whenever we look at a math problem, we look at the parentheses. The other thing that we need to keep in mind as we're evaluating parentheses is that inside of parentheses, the order of operations still applies. So order of operations applies inside. And that means, like, if we have two operations inside of the parentheses, we still have to follow the order of operations while we're inside of those parentheses. So the first thing we do when we're evaluating an expression in math is we evaluate it inside of those parentheses. Then, once we've exhausted all of the parentheses, we move on to the second step, which is E. And E stands for exponents. So after we've evaluated all of the parentheses, we then move forward and we evaluate all of the exponents. Then after that, we move on to this MD level. And you'll notice that I have M and D on the same level, and I do that for a reason. M and D stand for multiply and divide. And when we multiply and divide, the reason they're on the same level is because we evaluate these from left to right. So multiplication doesn't necessarily come before division, and division doesn't necessarily come before multiplication. We multiply and divide from left to right. And then finally, these last two stand for add and subtract. And again, like the multiplication and division, we evaluate addition and subtraction also from left to right. So one doesn't necessarily come before the other. We move from left to right, addition and subtraction together. So we'll be using these to evaluate some problems on the next slides. So let's start here with example 1. So make sure you have this written down in your notebook so that as we start to solve it together, you can underline and model how we go through with the order of operations. So remember, order of operations is P, E, M and D on the same line, A and S on the same line. So we start with parentheses. So we look here and we notice that this problem contains parentheses here. And as a result, we're going to evaluate what's inside of the parentheses first. So we see a multiplication problem in there, and 3 times 5 gives us 15 inside of those parentheses. Now, because we've evaluated the parentheses, once we know what number alone represents what's inside the parentheses, we can then drop the parentheses. And here we now see that we have 4 plus 8 minus 15. So we evaluated the parentheses. Next comes the exponents, but I don't see any exponents, so we're going to skip that step. Next comes multiplication and division. Again, I don't see any multiplication and division left over to do, so we skip that step. And then last comes addition and subtraction. What I like to do, especially after that parentheses and exponent step, is before I go through multiplication, division, addition, subtraction, I like to go through and utilize keep, change, change anywhere that I see subtraction. So this is an addition symbol, but here's subtraction, so we're going to use keep, change, change here. And I'm going to rewrite this as 4 plus 8 plus negative 15. So now what we're going to do is we're going to evaluate this from left to right for addition and subtraction. So we start here, 4 plus 8, that becomes 12. And then 12 plus negative 15 becomes negative 3. So again, let's go through our order of operations here. So our first step we know is to exhaust all the parentheses, but I don't see any parentheses here, so we can check that step off. The next step is to evaluate our exponents, and I'm just going to go left to right for our exponents. So here the first exponent I see is 4 squared. So 4 squared represents 4 times 4, which is 16. So we start with that first one, and then we move forward and we see we have another exponent, so we're going to evaluate that one next. So 16 divided by 2 times 2, which is 2 squared, is 4. Now after the exponent step, I like to pause and utilize keep, change, change wherever I see that I can. So here I notice there's a subtraction symbol here, so I'm going to do keep, change, change. So this becomes 16 divided by 4 plus negative 8 divided by 2 times 3. So now I'm going to perform my third step, which is multiplication and division, and we go from left to right. So as I go through, I'm going to find the first multiplication and divisions from left to right. So first I see 16 divided by 4, so that becomes 4, and then plus negative 8 divided by 2 times 3. Then I look for the next one, and I see negative 8 divided by 2. So that becomes 4 plus negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4 times 3. Then I look for my next multiplication and division, and I see it's right here, negative 4 times 3, so that becomes 4 plus negative 12. So now that I've finished my multiplication and division step, I then notice I have one addition left, 4 plus negative 12, which results in negative 8. So here in example 3, we're going to start with our PEMDAS over here. We know that our first step is to take care of parentheses, but I see none. Next step is to take care of exponents, but I don't see any. Then at this point, once I get through parentheses and exponents, I want to look for keep, change, change that I can switch. So I see a keep, change, change, a keep, change, change. So I'm going to rewrite that quick to be 14 plus negative 8 plus 2 plus negative 6 plus 7. Then from here I want to do multiplication and division from left to right, but I see none. So now I'm just going to focus here on this addition and subtraction piece, and I'm going to do addition and subtraction from left to right. So we start with this first addition here, so that becomes 14 plus negative 8, which is 6. Then our next two, 6 plus 2 is 8. Eight plus negative 6 is 2. And 2 plus 7 ends us with 9. So example 4, you can see they're now starting to get a little bit more difficult here as we move forward. So first we start off with parentheses, which I can see right here. So I'm going to start off by evaluating inside of those parentheses. 10 minus 6 gives us 4. So I'm going to put the rest of the problem in there now. 5 times 4, 10 times 2. Okay. Then after we evaluate all of the parentheses, we move on to exponents, which I see right here. So 4 squared is really 4 times 4, which is 16. So I add in the rest of the problem there. Now we've evaluated all of the exponents. At this point, before we do multiply, divide, add, subtract, I like to go through and evaluate the keep, change, change. I only see one in here, so it'd be keep, change, change. So I still have 5 times 4 divided by 10 times 2, and it's plus negative 16 plus 4. So now I can move on to multiplication and division from left to right. Remember, it goes left to right. So we start here with 5 times 4, so that's 20. Then we do the next multiplication and division from left to right. So I see 20 divided by 10, which is 2. Then I see my next one, 2 times 2 is 4. And so now I've finished all the multiplication and division, so I move on to addition and subtraction. So I see here 4 plus negative 16, which is negative 12. Plus 4 leaves us with negative 8. And last but not least, our final problem. So here again, we start with our parentheses. So here I have 4 minus 6. Just because that's a little bit difficult for me to look at, I'm going to turn that into a keep, change, change problem. So that becomes 4 plus negative 6. And I know 4 plus negative 6 gives me negative 2. So my first step here is I evaluate my parentheses, is that I find inside of my parentheses is a negative 2. So I've evaluated that first step. Then next I look at the exponents, and here I have negative 2 squared, so that's negative 2 times negative 2, which is 4. And then that itself gets multiplied by that 3. Now I'm just copying the rest of the problem down, going backwards while I do it. Okay, so now we've got all the exponents. Now at this point, this is when I like to go through and evaluate all of the keep, change, changes. So I see I have one keep, change, change right here. So this becomes 4 times 5 plus negative 9 times 4 divided by 3 times 3 plus 3 times 4. Whew. All right, from here we're now going to evaluate all of the multiply and divide from left to right. So we start with 4 times 5, which is 20. And then we write down the rest of the problem. Then we notice that our next multiplication or division is right here at negative 9 times 4. So that becomes negative 36. Then we see our next multiplication or division, negative 36 divided by 3. That becomes negative 12. Then our next multiplication or division we see is negative 12 times 3, which is a negative 36. And then our last multiplication here is 3 times 4, which is 12. So I've now evaluated the multiplication and division step. And then last, I take a look at the addition and subtraction from left to right. 20 plus negative 36 gives me negative 16. Plus 12 leaves me with negative 4.